by introduction, there's a story about a famous Israeli philosopher who comes to the United States for a visit, and he's interviewed on his first day in the States, and the radio interviewer says to him, "Can you tell us in a word, how are things in Israel?" And he says, "Good." And he said, "In 2 words?" He said, "No good." So in some ways that little story resonates with a lot of us, I think, and we're very fortunate to have Ambassador Dennis Ross with us, the author of the new book, Doomed to Success, which follows in personal and historical detail the U.S. Israel relationship over the years. Ambassador Ross is certainly no one has more knowledge about U.S. Middle East policy from the inside than Ambassador Ross. He's helped shape policy for nearly 30 years under 4 presidents, Republicans and Democrats, most recently with the National Security Council under President Obama as special assistant to the president on not only the Middle East, but on the Persian Gulf, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia. It's like almost a full-time job.
They wanted to keep me off the streets.
Yes. He also played a key role in the Israel-Jordan peace agreement and took part in the talks between Israel and Syria. His book, his latest book is, I believe, a must-read for anyone seeking a deeper understanding of the complex love-hate relationship between successive U.S. and Israeli leaders, and it's an honor to have you here. Before we talk about your book, since we're literally on the eve of the first meeting between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu in more than a year, I want to ask you a little bit about what we might expect from tomorrow's meeting.
Well, I also think the meeting is probably doomed to succeed. I say that because both the President and the Prime Minister have an interest in this meeting going well. The Prime Minister comes in an atmosphere where Israelis are suffering from daily, if random, terror assaults. He certainly wants, at a moment of this sort, to have the envelopment, the appearance of a strong U.S.-Israeli relationship and strong U.S. support for Israel. He's also coming at a time when, even though he opposed the Iran nuclear deal, probably nobody has a greater stake in its enforcement than he does. And the reality is that within 6 months, less than that, the Iranians will fulfill their major obligations that are called for within the deal, which I can spell out if you want to get into it. Once they do that, their stake in living up to the deal is not going to be nearly as strong. Their impulse to certainly cheat, at least along the margins, will go up. So you have the Prime Minister of Israel, who will be the strongest single advocate for truly having the Iranians live up to the deal, because living up to the deal, if it's enforced, buys you 15 years. So he has a huge stake now in its implementation. So he'll want to talk about its implementation. He'll want to talk about also what the Israelis are facing with Hezbollah and the Revolutionary Guard now positioned along the border above the Golan Heights. So he has an agenda. He has a set of needs. The president has an interest too. There are quite a few Democrats who went out on a limb for the president to ensure that the deal, the Iranian nuclear deal, in fact, would not be blocked by the Congress. They want the relationship to be mended. He made promises to them. He made promises in his letters to Congressman Nadler about what he would do on completing a memorandum of understanding. This is a 10-year deal that replaces what was concluded by the Bush administration in 2007. He made promises about preserving the qualitative military edge. So the Israelis are coming with a set of interests as it relates to that. The president has made a number of commitments. So at least at this level, you're going to see the meeting go well. And I just note one other thing. One interesting element that you see when you go through the book as I know you all will. Um, One interesting thing that you see is that every time in the past when we've had real tension between presidents and prime ministers, we've seen the period after that actually be a period of improvement. The relationship between Reagan and Begin was not a good one. One of the lowest points of the relationship was during the summer of 1982. Reagan threatens the relationship on 5 separate occasions, threatens the future of the relationship. And Reagan is actually remembered, legitimately so, as the president who transforms the relationship. He does. He builds an institutional relationship that promotes real strategic cooperation for the first time, military to military, defense industry to defense industry, intelligence to intelligence, even economic. Israel is running, people won't remember this, but in the year 1985, Israel has an inflation rate of 1,260% after the Lebanon war. And it's because of the Reagan administration, the reforms that George Shultz asked, and the infusion of an additional $3 billion a year over and above what was being provided to the Israelis because of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, that reduces that in 1 year from 1,260% to 15%. George H.W. Bush, who talked about being one lonely guy against thousands of lobbyists descending on the Hill because of the loan guarantees, he's the guy after that who helps to produce 44 countries either establishing or restoring diplomatic relations with Israel, and then in December of 1991 is responsible for us leading a campaign to rescind Zionism as racism. So the fact is we've had these periods before where there's been really acute tension between presidents and prime ministers, and it's typically been followed by what has been an improvement. I don't say that because I want you to suddenly feel, gee, everything's fine, or that the relationship between this president and this prime minister is going to become completely transformed. It won't be. They have different worldviews. But there is a precedent for this. There is a legacy, and the reality of the fundamental elements that bind us remain strong. And the next administration is going to, I think, will feel strongly about restoring some of the intimacy of the relationship.
So you described in the book a number of highs and lows in the U.S. Israel relationship, and I think many of us think of the Iran deal as perhaps the lowest. Where does it rank, or what else should we be comparing it to?
Well, I don't look. The real low in the relationship is the 1956 Suez campaign, where Eisenhower threatened sanctions on Israel to take away the tax-exempt status of contributions to Israel. He has his Undersecretary of State threaten the expulsion of Israel from the UN. I mean, that
was bad.
That was what was you start off by saying, how are things?
Yeah.
So in a word, that was bad.
Right.
Okay. That's the low. I think 82, the summer of 82 is also quite low. People focus on this for an understandable reason, because the nature of the deal, the way Iran is perceived, the legacy of the perception of Iran, the fact that the supreme leader in the aftermath of this deal, everything he says, every statement he makes gets worse, not better, which was entirely predictable. And I think, again, one of the things that will actually draw us closer together, we will see the Iranian behavior in the region get worse in the coming months, not better, once they get the sanctions relief, because the supreme leader is focused on validating his ideology after doing the deal. One of the reasons you've seen a crackdown in Iran, where you have more arrests now, not just of journalists, but of poets. You have those who are seen as being on the more liberal side, and I put it in quotes, of the Iranian political perspective, now in trouble, because there's a kind of compensation for having done the deal on the nuclear issue. He didn't do the deal because he wanted to transform relations. He did the deal to get sanctions relief.
And is the U.S. so invested in this deal now that we are going to look the other way, whether it's a missile test or other ways of their testing us?
Look, when they did this ballistic missile test, which is a violation of a Security Council resolution, the administration said it's a violation of the Security Council resolution, not a violation of the deal, which was right. But that's also another way of sort of explaining away, okay, it's a violation of a Security Council resolution, but they don't respect the Security Council resolutions anyway. They have to respect this deal. I do think that, again, I come back to the Prime Minister of Israel has a huge stake in this deal now being actually implemented. And the administration, I think, will find, given the promises it's made and given some of the legislation that's currently being worked on the Hill right now, which, by the way, the Cardin legislation is not being opposed by the administration. There may be others that Engel Royce may be, but the Cardin legislation is not being opposed. There's an initiative also to have a kind of congressional oversight of implementation along the lines of what we've seen with previous arms control agreements. These are things that I think are very important because one of the things they do is they preserve the administration's stake in not trying to explain away what might be Iranian violations. Other members of the 5+1, I believe, will be, their instinct will be, well, let's just see if we can get them to correct the violation as opposed to let's impose penalties. It's very important that every transgression that they commit is in fact accompanied by a price. I'm not talking about a disproportionate price, but they have to see they don't get away with violations of the deal because it will erode the baseline and it will erode the deterrence. And one of my sources of unease about the deal was what happens after 15 years. After 15 years, Iran is not limited in terms of the size or the quality of the nuclear infrastructure it can build.
So you've dealt with Prime Minister Netanyahu for many years. I think many of us still wonder what he wants in terms of certainly in terms of the Palestinians. Do we have a clear sense of and also he's been described here and elsewhere as one of the most risk-averse leaders that Israel has had. Have we, at this point, come to an idea of what he really wants to have happen?
Well, I do think to understand him, you have to understand that in the first instance, he tends to focus on the threats that he sees. And that very much colors his approach to things. Look, I've dealt with him. I probably spent more time than any other American official with him. I am convinced that when he says he favors a two-state outcome, he favors a two-state outcome. But he also looks at the region right now, the character of the risks. He looks at the political realities in Israel, where most of the body politic is focused on those threats, sees no credibility on the Palestinian side in terms of being committed to a two-state outcome. He is very riveted on wanting to ensure that any deal would not threaten Israel's ability to still, in a sense, preempt a Hamas emerging in the West Bank, or the infiltration of rockets or rocket-making materials into the West Bank. And so long as he is riveted on those threats, it will color his view of the terms that you could accept in terms of an outcome. Now, the truth is, even if he wasn't, there's no deal today. You don't have a Palestinian leader who is prepared to do a deal. The level of dysfunction on the Palestinian side, the level of weakness on the Palestinian side, the level of the deep sense of grievance on the Palestinian side makes the very idea of compromise with Israel unacceptable. I heard the tail end of the previous group, talking about Ilan Goldenberg was saying that the Arabs don't have the kind of interest. Now, he wasn't referring to the peace issue. He was referring to the issue of convergence. They may not have that interest, but I think the question is good statecraft and good diplomacy probes things privately. If I were doing the kind of things I used to do, I would go to President Sisi. I would go to King Abdullah, who, by the way, who does have more of a stake in this. I would go to the Crown Prince of the Emirates. I would go to King Salman, and I would basically say, look, under what circumstances would you be prepared to do something on the Palestinian issue, understanding that you will actually have to accept the responsibility for the concessions that Palestinians will have to sign up to. They won't. They can't. What would you need from the Israelis to be able to do it? And then I would go to the Israelis and I would say to the Prime Minister, the Arab states are prepared to do the following. And here's what they would be prepared, by the way, to provide you if you're prepared to make certain concessions for the Palestinians. What would you need from them? And then I'd see if you could produce a quiet conversation. Now, the truth is, at this point, peacemaking is not what you can focus on. Conflict management is what you're going to focus on. Diffusing tensions is what you're going to focus on. Trying to create, as I said to the plenary, a sense of possibility again. You know, opening up Area C. 60% of the West Bank is known as Area C, where the Israelis retain complete control. Now, they allow some very limited Palestinian economic activity here. It's entirely ad hoc. But if you allowed Palestinians to build there, first they would to build housing. They have an acute housing shortage. They have an employment problem shortage. Construction is a major part of their, frankly, of their economy. If you could create a sense of possibility, one of the things that's interesting about what's going on with the level of violence and the terror, you don't have the Palestinian public joining in. You know, you compare this to the first two intifadas, you don't have mass demonstration. You don't have, you know, this kind of solidarity being demonstrated in terms of mass boycotts, mass strikes. You don't have that. You know, the impact of the second intifada is still with most Palestinians. The economy today in the West Bank is still lower than it was in the year 2000. You know, Palestinians lost 4,000 dead in the second intifada. So there isn't a rush to say, gee, let's go back to that again. So if you could create a sense of possibility, saying, all right, we're going to open up Area C. We're not going to redefine it. We're not going to redesignate it. That would take a political decision. But we'll allow housing, Palestinian housing in Area C. We'll allow an industrial zone in Area C. We'll allow Palestinians to own the rock quarries. There are 11, all owned by Israelis in Area C. I mean, there are things you could do that send a signal that it's not just movement that might be eased, but you'll do things economically. And you're not saying this is a substitute for politics, but it would be a signal that something could change.
Right. So you've said that a major reason why you wrote this book is for the next administration, the policymakers, the president, to learn some of the, what you call false assumptions that we've been operating under in terms of Middle East policy. And actually you mentioned in the earlier plenary session that along the way you learned some new things as well. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that. So.
Well, the thing that I was struck by was that originally when I was going to sit down to write this book, I was going to do an overview of the administrations prior to the time that I went into government. And what I found was when I went back in time with an overview in mind, when I went back in time, I suddenly found not just all the same arguments, but I found actually the same words in different instances. I mean, two in particular stand out. One is a conversation Kissinger was having with Abba Eban in 1971, where he was asking Eban to let him know what it was Israel could do. Gunnar Yaring was a UN envoy. He'd posed questions to Sadat. He posed questions to Golda Meir. The Sadat responded. The Israelis didn't respond. And Kissinger says, look, tell us. We won't tell Yaring. We won't tell Sadat. We're your only friends. Tell us. Now, I had my own conversations like this with Ehud Barak. Jimmy Carter had his conversations at Camp David exactly like that. Condi Rice had this same conversation with Ehud Olmert. In 2011, Hillary Clinton had the same conversation with Bibi Netanyahu. In all these cases, it was the same conversation. The Israelis in every case held back, mostly because they were afraid that it was a slippery slope.
That'll be the line, and then you'll push a little further.
Right. Yeah. Whatever we tell you won't be good enough.
Right.
So, you know, there's an obvious fix to that. The fix is when you go through and say to the Israelis, look, we understand why you're afraid to reveal. So here's what we're going to say to you. A, we understand the nature of your fear. B, if you tell us what you can do and we think it's not going to work, we're not going to try to sell it, we're not going to push it, but we're not going to press you. Okay, this is what you can do. But if you tell us this is what you can do and we think it's really legitimate and it's really fair and it's appropriate, then we will push it on the other side. And if the other side isn't prepared to accept something like this, then we're prepared. We're not going to go farther. We're also prepared to say you were prepared to offer something that was legitimate and fair, and the other side isn't prepared. to
Right.
make any meaningful concessions. I mean, one of the things that stood out to me as well was over time, you know, frequently when we would ask something of the Israelis, they would then experience that it wouldn't be good enough, and we would come back to them. So it's not like there wasn't a history on their side. I mean, one of the problems, and apropos of your question, the Israelis remember every single thing that has happened. We have administrations that come in at the top and they don't remember anything. I'll tell you one interesting story. In this administration, and when you read the whole Obama chapter, you'll get a full flavor of this. At one point, we're having a meeting in the Situation Room, and Robert Gates, Secretary of Defense, responds to something I said, and he says, look, Dennis has Talmudic understanding and memory of everything related to do with the peace issue. And the President says, President Obama says, you know, sometimes I think that, you know, being so consumed, knowing all these details actually becomes paralyzing and makes it hard to break free. And I say, you know, that's a fair point. The only problem is you're dealing with people for whom these issues are not an avocation, they're a preoccupation. And if you don't know it, then they feel the need to constantly educate you on their needs. And you'll never break through because you never break through to being able to explain the other side's needs to them.
So when your book came out, and it's a 400-page plus book, there were a number of news stories that generally focused on your description about Susan Rice when she was National Security Advisor and how critical she was of Israel. I'm sure in some ways that's frustrating that the media sort of picks up on one item out of hundreds of pages. But I guess the larger question is, when you're writing a book like that and you're writing about people who are still in office and contemporary, does it have sort of a chilling effect, or how do you determine sort of who you're going to out and who you give a break to?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, in writing about that particular episode, what I was trying to do was, in a sense, highlight 2 points. One was to show the contrast between Susan Rice and her predecessor, Tom Donilon, and how one was absolutely committed to collaboration and close cooperation with the Israelis, and he actually managed differences more effectively as a result. It wasn't that there weren't differences on Iran. The difference was he managed the relationship in a way where, I quote his counterpart as saying, you know, look, we understood how serious the Americans were. There was a different point of departure on this, but we felt the need to take the American concerns seriously into account. So I was showing the contrast between his approach and hers, which tended to produce misunderstandings. And I actually recount an episode there where, in fact, there was a profound misunderstanding between the president and the prime minister, and I was actually witness to it because I saw the prime minister right after a 90-minute phone call. This is on November 8th, 2013, the day that Secretary Kerry was in Israel, and he was going from there. He announced that he was going to Geneva to close what was the interim deal on Iran.
2 years ago today.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. 2 years ago today. And so I see the prime minister, and he's completely disturbed. And he feels the president has said to him that because of the mood in the country, we can't, the military option can't be on the table, and you got to get the best deal you can get. And I say to the prime minister, because I know him well, I said, I know the president didn't say that. I know he didn't say that. And he said, no, that's what I understood. I said, I'm telling you, I know he didn't say that. Maybe he said, given the mood in our country, we have to show we did everything to try to solve this diplomatically. And this deal, this interim deal, the Joint Plan of Action, is consistent with doing that. If it doesn't work, we will still have the option, but we have to show we've done everything we could to try to resolve this diplomatically. And he said, no, I understood it differently. So I went out of the meeting, and I actually contacted Secretary Kerry, got a message to him. He called me back immediately, and I said, you've got a real problem. The Prime Minister of Israel is convinced that he heard the President has taken the military option off the table. I couldn't dissuade him from that. And the Secretary said to me, well, look, I'll call him. I said, the problem isn't you. He heard it from the President. It has to be corrected by the President. You got to get the White House to fix this. And I drew the contrast with a similar episode in 2012 and what Tom Donilon had done, and I pointed out what Susan Rice had done. And my point was, here's what the implication is when you have someone who approaches the Israelis from a more competitive, combative approach. And I put her in a context. I said, every administration has had a constituency that had that kind of a mindset that viewed Israel as being a problem and not a partner. And I wasn't singling her out to make it personal. I was showing she was a reflection of a mindset and a constituency that has been in every administration from Truman to Obama.
I guess another sort of personal, somewhat personal question is, since you are an identified Jew, I wonder how that factored into your acceptance in the Middle East, but, you know, in the Arab states, and particularly there was a time when James Baker was Secretary of State, and it was you and Aaron Miller and Danny Kurtzer, Baker's boys, and how did that play out? And how?
Look, at the time, you know, there was, there were a lot of stories in the Arab media about that. By the way, there's some stories in the American media about that as well.
Right.
I often felt the relationship I had with the negotiators was not a function of that. The reason was because they got to know me. They knew that they could count on me. They knew that what I said was never a manipulation. They knew that what I said is what I believed. They knew that I would go to bat for them. You know, the fact is, when you're a mediator, what are you trying to do? I gave a speech in Gaza in 2005. This was during the Bush administration. I wasn't part of the administration, but I was invited by Ziad Abu Amr, who was a senior member of Fatah, to go to Gaza and speak. And when I got there, unbeknownst to me, the first person I saw was Mahmoud Zahar, one of the leaders, one of the founders of Hamas. And before I could say anything to Ziad says, "We thought the opposition ought to hear you." At the time when I walked in, there's a couple hundred people, and I realized that like half of the leadership of Hamas was in this room, and I was thinking, gee, I think my relationship with Sharon is pretty good. Anyway, the reason I tell the story is because, you know, I spoke, and then all the questions were, you know, America can't be an honest broker. And I said, you know, you don't want an honest broker. I mean, the truth is what you're asking for is you want us to be partial to you. That's what you're really asking for. You say the American can't be an honest broker. For the last 4 years, in the Bush administration, for the first 4 years, the Bush administration walked away from it. The Intifada got dramatically worse. That's when, you know, you end up losing 4,000 Palestinians, 1,100 Israelis. Got dramatically worse. I said, are you better off? I mean, the Bush administration didn't prevent the Europeans from coming in, who are much more favorable to you. The Russians from coming in, much more favorable to you. Did that serve you well? Nobody there challenged that. I said, what you want are effective brokers. You know, those who viewed me and knew that I was Jewish, at the end of the day, what they knew was when there was a problem, I would always be the guy they came to try to fix it. And so I had a relationship that wasn't a function of that. They saw me as basically being someone who wouldn't mislead them. Now, it was convenient at times when, you know, when they didn't like what we were doing, to say, oh, well, you know why, to put it out in the press, well, you know why he's so tough on us? He's Jewish. But was that something that I felt during the course of the negotiations? No.
Okay. I'm going to open this up to questions in just a minute, and we have about another 10 minutes for that. I just wanted to ask you again, going back to the post-nuclear deal situation, where bipartisanship has been the foundation of the U.S. Israel relationship. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about how seriously this deal has damaged that, and are Democrats who have been really chastised publicly by some in the American Jewish community, you know, licking their wounds, or are they going to be bending over a bit backwards to show that they really do care about Israel? How do you see this playing out?
You know, look, what in the concluding chapter of the book, I identify a number of alarm bells that while while the book is called Doomed to Succeed, which is obviously a kind of, it's ironic title, but it's basically an optimistic title, that doesn't mean you can take the relationship for granted, and it doesn't mean there aren't some alarm bells. Well, you know, the fact is we will become a majority country in about 25 to 30 years, meaning Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and African Americans will become the majority. They don't have a history of relationship with Israel. Therefore, Israel's values as a democracy are very important to preserve, but also Israel as a non-partisan issue is essential to preserve. And I think while the way the Iran issue was approached, I think compounded that, raised questions about it. What you are seeing is, and I started off our conversation by saying this, I think there are plenty of Democrats on the Hill who went to bat for the president who are committed to the relationship with Israel, and they want the president to do his part to mend the fences. And so it isn't bending over backwards, but it's a reflection of who they are and their commitment and their identity and support for Israel. I think that's an important part of this, but I think it's also very important that, you know, that those, and I've said this on a lot of occasions publicly, those who consider them friends of Israel are not true friends of Israel if they want to turn Israel into a partisan issue.
Mm-hmm. Good. If you have a question, if you can raise your hand or question.
The question was not related to the Middle East and not related to my book, which I'm most happy to talk about. It's about the book that's coming out about George H.W. Bush and the revelations that he was able to restrain his enthusiasm for Vice President Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. Look, not really. I mean, the fact is, I don't think this comes as a huge surprise to anybody. You know, there was a lot of speculation at the time that George W. Bush's administration was pursuing some policies that George H.W. Bush probably would not have pursued, and the best indication of that were articles by Brent Scowcroft, whom President Bush was very close to, that raised questions about what was going on then. Well, I think we should put the missile threat in perspective. The Iranian missile threat to Israel pales in comparison to what Iran has done to ensure that Hezbollah would have 100,000 rockets that cover Israel. And the rockets that they have provided, the missiles they have provided, have increasingly become more accurate and have more range and can cover the scope of Israel. There's, you know, between Hezbollah and Hamas now, there is no part of Israel that is not going to be affected by rockets. Those numbers dwarf what the Iranians have that could reach Israel. So the real threat to Israel from Iran is what Iran has been doing to support Hezbollah and to some extent Hamas. The ballistic missile threat that they're developing is something that ought to concern us, because they're developing what is a delivery vehicle for a nuclear weapon if they had it. It isn't this notion that after 8 years the agreement allows them no longer to be subject to the Security Council resolution that limits this, which, by the way, they don't recognize anyway because you saw them test this. The fact is the key is that there's something known as the Missile Technology Control Regime, which emerged in the first Bush administration, the Bush 41 administration, which both the Russians and the Chinese actually respect. Obviously, the North Koreans don't. So that will still apply to whether they can get help for ballistic missile development. They clearly are fairly advanced because they've been able to do these knockoffs from what they got from North Korea. But our concern, I mean, one of the reasons I want a firewall established now between their threshold nuclear status and their weapons status after 15 years, I want them to know if they even think about moving towards that. I want them to know if they violate their commitment in the agreement, that means the use of force, not sanctions, and they will lose their nuclear infrastructure. Well, I would say good luck. Oh, the question had to do with transparency on monies that go for settlement building in the West Bank, whether from federations or not. Look, all I can tell you is good luck ever producing transparency on monies that go for settlement building. If you read the book, as I hope you will, in the chapter on George H.W. Bush, one of the things that I convinced President Bush to do an initial loan guarantee of $400 million. I convinced him on the basis of twofold, that Shamir knew that this was a drop in the bucket to what the Israelis were going to need based on the number of Jews coming out of the Soviet Union at this point. The number, between 1989 and 1990 there was an extraordinary, explosion in the numbers. We're talking about 15 times as many coming in 1 year, and this being, a small indicator of what was happening. And I said he's not going to jeopardize. He's not going to jeopardize what's going to have to be a much larger loan guarantee for those coming by increasing settlement building after he gets the $400 million in loan guarantees. And we negotiated a deal. I actually negotiated it. It was a letter from then Foreign Minister David Levy to Secretary James Baker that was outlined what was going to be transparency on monies that were going into settlement building, so we could see if there was any increase once they got the loan guarantees. And that letter was never fulfilled. I lost all with Bush on that issue. I lost all credibility. I was right that this was a drop in the bucket. I was wrong that, in fact, at the time there wouldn't be any impulse to jeopardize the next big tranche of loan guarantees. So if you look historically, it's been always very difficult to determine how much money goes for settlement building, in part because you got a lot of development towns in Israel, and there's been a desire to sort of disguise the monies that go for settlement building as opposed to what goes for the development towns. So I understand why you're asking the question, but I wouldn't have high expectations.
All right, we're just about out of time. I just, again, short term, I encourage you to read the Jewish Week. We have a review and interview with Ambassador Ross about the book in this current issue. And I certainly encourage you to read the book. And one of the things I think you'll find fascinating is the sometimes counterintuitive idea. Many people in the Jewish community, sort of measure presidents by their kishka support of Israel, whether they have an emotional connection to Israel or not. And when you read the book, you see that doesn't always affect the Middle East policy outcome. So that's just one teaser for the book. Yes. But I want to thank all of you for being here, and I want to thank you, Dennis, for being with us. My pleasure.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.